There's a lot of misconceptions out there, dangerous misconceptions. The one I'm closest to is this Gaia hypothesis. The misconception is if we can only go back to nature, somehow the sense that if we can get rid of all the civilized trappings, that the world will heal itself. I think everybody has a sense that we have dented the world. We have certainly put our footprint upon it, and it may not be in the best particular way. We're going to have to figure out how to raise standard of living in a gentle energy fashion, or as gently as we can in terms of what's going to happen to the atmosphere. And this is where I personally think there's no stopping the rising sea level, that it's going to happen, that we're going to have to deal with it, that we're going to be moving cities.
Genetically modified organism is simply an organism like any other organism that produces tens of thousands of proteins, but one or two of them were proteins that were chosen specifically by us humans. Genetic engineering is necessary for the continued success of the human experiment here on planet Earth. Just like the advent of nitrogen fixing allowed for more fertile fields that saved millions from starvation, the fruits of genetic engineering, sometimes literally, will help us face the significant challenges of a world with more and more people and a climate that is less and less stable.
In September 2012, the first long-term study on the effects of GMOs being consumed by live organisms was completed. The results were disturbing. GMOs turn food into poison. Consumption of such foods may cause a massive increase in cancer for all who eat them. When tested on rats, genetically modified foods cause them to develop horrifying tumors and other related diseases. 70% of the female population died prematurely, and virtually all of them suffered severe organ damage from consuming GMOs.
At this point, people have been studying the impacts that humans have had on the world around us for a solid 50 years, and while it's hard to get a handle on exactly how the choices we make every day affect the environment, there's no question that our lifestyles, our cars, our need for more farmland, and our love of all kinds of plastic stuff are putting the hurt on ecosystems all over the world. By that, I mean they specifically have to have their biodiversity intact, because ecosystems are just a bunch of living and non-living things working together, so unless their living parts are healthy, they're basically just rocks and weather. The main reason biodiversity is so important is that it makes ecosystems more resilient to that never-ending change we talked about a few weeks ago. Ecosystems with high biodiversity are way more resilient to disturbances than those with low biodiversity. In a high biodiversity system, if you take one species out of the mix, it's less likely that the ecosystem will collapse. Take a hectare of Amazonian rainforest. In that little patch of land, there are more different species of plants and animal than there are in all of Europe. So if a species of insect goes extinct, there's less risk that the whole house of cards will fall than, say, in the Sonoran Desert, where there are very few organisms, so the disappearance of one species could affect the entire ecosystem. So the best way to understand our impacts on the environment is through how we affect biodiversity. Unfortunately, it turns out that we've been doing a really bang-up job of endangering some of the highest biodiversity ecosystems on the planet. In some cases, we're having impacts on the organisms themselves directly. In other cases, we're affecting biodiversity indirectly by creating one or two changes in that ecosystem that cascade into all kinds of problems for living things. First, let's look at that hectare of Amazonian rainforest again, because even though it's one of those super resilient ecosystems, we're having serious impacts on it. How? Well, first by removing a lot of what makes a forest, trees. According to some estimates, we are clear-cutting around 8,000 hectares of trees a day to provide land to graze cattle on, and to harvest wood to make coffee tables or whatever. When you cut down a hectare of rainforest, suddenly a place where a few thousand species used to live turns into a place where just a handful of species live. Some grass, some weeds, maybe some rats or mice, some insects, and, you know, some cows. Because, man, we love cows.
There are 196 countries in the world. 25 of them are very rich, defined as having an average wealth per person of over $100,000 a year. They are. But far more countries are quite poor, and some, which we're considering here, are very, very poor. These are the 20 poorest countries in the world, where the per capita wealth is under $1,000 a year, or under $3 a day. Every country is now more or less on a path to growth, but the poor ones are growing very, very slowly. If Zimbabwe continues at its current growth rate, it will qualify as a rich country in 2,722 years.